Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to move into a Q&A session. I note that we have eaten over a quarter of an hour into this, and speaking of eating, I don't want to deprive you of your lunch for too long. Can I just first ask the panelists to all shuffle forward so that the front row see more than just our somewhat shiny, in some cases, heads? And also to ask the questioners in the audience, when the microphone comes to you, could you please hold it close to your mouth, because we've received a message from, I think, the group in Birmingham watching this event that they can't quite make out some of the audience questions. But okay, so let's have so our first questioner, yes, gentleman there, and then we have another one, either one of the raised hands. I really don't care. We'll come to both of you.
Yes. E.B. Friedman, University of Rochester. I heard a theme. What I heard from Professor Sachs was a kind of a macro model about standard of living. From Dr. Lahar, a micro model of standard of living. I hear that China wants to have a higher standard of living. I hear that 6 billion people want to enjoy their standard of living. Nobody wants to change. So how do we convince all these people to change their standard of living, lower their standard of living, to be honest, is what I hear. That, to me, is the theme of the whole panel.
Well, who would like to address that? Either of you gentlemen to my right, or do you? Yeah, Jeff.
Just a word. I'm not sure that it really is lowering the standard of living in a meaningful way. To the extent that we shift to more sustainable technologies, which can outcompete some of the heavy resource-using technologies, we can have a higher quality of life, save the planet, and not really deprive people of crucial things that they need. Better education, better health care. A lot of the technologies are going to allow us to do more with less footprint on the planet. And I think that really is should be our way forward in this. It isn't only to restrict. Probably with smart grids, smart vehicles, smarter applications of these technologies, things that really count for people in terms of quality of life will improve.
Did anyone else want to add to that? John?
Very briefly, I think one should not underestimate the challenge of making these changes, and I'd suggest that it's going to happen in phases. And really, the point I was going to make was the first phase is that we need to engage the rest of our countries in the kind of things that we see as obvious and necessary, but many people don't even recognize as something that they should be engaged with.
I have a second question.
Hello, I'm Jared Dunman from Oxford University. I had a quick question, probably directed more at Professor Sachs and Juma, but whoever, of course, wants to chime in. You both mentioned the role of engineers in different ways in politics. Professor Sachs lamenting the inability of some politicians to understand very complex engineering problems and address them appropriately. And then in the developing world, Professor Juma talked about how 6 African countries now have engineers as president. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the best ways that engineers can and scientists really can impact the development of society and addressing these challenges through engagement in the public sector, and how that relates to current and traditional emphases in engineering education.
I think that in addition to the actual engineering that we've heard a lot about, one of the things that is absolutely vital is to help the public, and through the public, the politicians, understand what's possible. We've debated, for example, climate change in the United States over 20 years, mainly around the issue of cap and trade. This is the least useful entry point to this discussion imaginable. What we have not had are scenarios, just like the UK ERC has been providing, of what this can really mean. We don't have the backcasting. Here's where we need to be in terms of carbon. What are the pathways that can get us there? Governments are very poorly equipped to do that work. Surprisingly, very disappointingly to me, governments that are poorly equipped have not asked engineering societies to work on it. The UK has developed an institution exactly for this, but we don't have that, for example, in the United States, and the vast majority of countries do not. So very few countries, and I'll put the U.S. on that list, very few countries have scenarios that can help the public to understand what these issues are about. And I think engineers, not alone, but together with other communities of knowledge and practice, can help make those scenarios so that we can understand why this is a transitional period. It has to be. From a mechanical point of view, I would say, it has to be a transitional period to something different. And the public has very, very little appreciation of that, and the politicians have not helped at all because they've been debating legalisms or they've been debating mechanisms. They've not really been, and they don't understand themselves, understanding what pathways, critical systems pathways of change might be. So I think there is a huge role to play here in that specific regard. The other role is to help make these technologies real and effective.
Angela, do you want to come in? Then I'll come to you, Christos. Yeah.
Well, I think I agree completely, and I believe that our jobs as engineers is one of public service. And so it's not only being in the lab, developing new products, and it's also public speaking. It's speaking in your library, speaking in your local elementary school, and talk about what it's like to be an engineer and what we're developing and the impact it could have on people's lives. And so I think it's a public image, and I think it's a public service.
Yeah, I'm currently chairing a high-level advisory panel for the African presidents on science, technology, and innovation. And this in conversations with them, basically the one message comes through that African politics is a footnote on poor infrastructure. It's transportation, energy, irrigation, and telecoms. Those are the things that preoccupy African leaders. So it's not a surprise that we are starting to see engineers, in fact, rising to positions of influence. The other interesting thing that is happening is that's the answer to your question in regard to how to structure the educational system. It's a significant shift towards experiential learning. And this focus, which is basically pragmatic training of young engineers, the area where it's most manifest, again, is in telecoms, which is most advanced. And we're starting to see the emergence of new telecoms universities in Africa that are not under the Ministry of Education, that is focused on issuing degrees, but they're in fact embedded in the Ministry of Telecoms that is focused on problem solving. And we have 3 examples in Egypt, Kenya, and Ghana. And there are a lot more experiments going on in other ministries with roads, basically upgrading research institutes within line ministries that have a practical orientation to become the new generation of institutions of higher learning. And now, again, this is something you can do a lot more easily if you are in a place that doesn't have a lot of universities. But if you have a very dominant universities that are defining what education looks like, it is much harder to do. It takes me back to my original point that you can do some of these things more easily in the new places.
We have a question from up in the gallery.
Zach Reaver. Zach Reaver. I'm a 5th-year student at the University of Toledo in bioengineering and biochemistry. My question's directed more towards Professor Sachs. Well, first off, I wanted to make a comment about the desertification. I saw a TED Talk about using huge livestock herds to simulate natural herds that has actually reduced desertification. So it's an interesting one if you haven't seen that TED Talk. I also wanted to comment about the politics you said. I know even as a student at my university, trying to get fellow students to be involved with sustainability and things like that is incredibly difficult. I started this green fund, and just getting people to opt into that is very, very difficult, even if you explain all the benefits to that. Now, coming from the economist's point of view, I usually don't hear economists talking about these issues. I was curious what your thoughts are on about having a new model of economics that's not based on growth, because I think we're all addicted to the concept of growth. You still have to have it, obviously, but in the society of today, you have to have a new model that's not based completely on that, but managing what we do have. And
okay, maybe that's
yeah, that's good.
That's
Sorry.
a good question to stop there. Jeff, did you want to comment briefly?
Very, very briefly, economics as a discipline, taught in our universities, became a denaturalized discipline in the 19th century. So while it started with the physiocrats and agriculture, land rents, Ricardo, and all of that, by the end of the 19th century, it was a system of differential equations where nature no longer had a role. This worked rather well if you could assume an elastic supply of primary commodities and ecosystem services at fixed relative price. You could show by formal theorizing you could just exclude them. Now we've reached boundary conditions. The shadow value of these resources is very high and rising, if I could put it that way. So we have to renaturalize economics, and this is part of what is happening. Fortunately, tools like massive GIS and putting nature back into an economic framework is there. But also there's a difference. I'll just add one more point. Economics needs to become much more of a system science than it is. It is a market science right now, not science. It's a market framework, but markets are not the sum of systems. And we need a both renaturalized and a systems basis to economics. So this is going to be a change in the coming generation. A lot of my colleagues don't know it yet, but this will be at least what's being taught a generation from now.
Lots of questions. Okay, very briefly, I'd like to ask a question, Allard, maybe to you. I think you're the only person who mentioned nexus as the stress nexus: food, water, energy. Do you think that the issues of population and quality of life and then environment are very often treated as very separate problems? And do you think that thinking is changing now at all?
Well, I do think it's changing. The question, of course, is it changing quickly and rapidly enough? And I suppose the one thing I didn't mention in context of the nexus is that we're also faced with, if you like, the broken triangle of trust between businesses, governments, and society. So I think we all do wish to change. However, we're not clear how we should change and how we should collaborate to change. I do believe that companies, leading institutions, academia, should not, as we have in the past, perhaps in the run-up to Rio, the run-up to Copenhagen, be looking at governments. I think now is the time for companies, NGOs, academia to stand up and look for those new collaborative models, and then go to governments and ask for the necessary policies. So it won't happen by itself. We need leading entities, leading organizations to show the way, and then seek the support from governments. And I hope we will be fast enough, but yes, we have a long journey ahead of us.
Questioner there with microphone, yes.
Hi, Will Stewart, Southampton University. I'd like to pick up on John Lafhead's point, which I would characterize as the social engineering being as important as the physical engineering, right? And then look back to something Craig Ventnor said, which is the example of world fisheries, which is another shared resource, global resource, where the science is well understood, the engineering is well understood, and the social engineering has been a complete disaster. So what new could we do for the social engineering to give us a chance on the CO2 problem, even the economic engineering, perhaps?
No, John.
I can't give an insightful or detailed answer to that, but I think to recognise that we've got to do it and that we've not so far done it well.
Okay, I wanted to bring in a question. Well, no one else wants to jump in. A question from Birmingham. Interesting one. They'd like to ask the panel their views that since we may start to colonise Mars within 20 years, Should we forget about the Earth and being sustainable and focus on Mars instead? That's rather ambitious. No. Okay. Anyone disagree with that? Good. Thank you, Birmingham. So we have a question. Gentleman here, unless someone's already holding a microphone. Oh, okay. Okay, so let's have you first, and then you.
Subhash Mahajan, University of California, Davis. I never heard anything about air. If the human beings or any organisms have to live, they have to get oxygen. And how can you maintain the purity of your environment and the air? What are we going to do with it? And the whole session, I didn't hear a word about it.
Do you mean pollution? Or
air, the pollution.
Right.
And that has to be taken care of, along with the development of all new developing societies. And I think it's a mistake to assume the developing countries will like to have the same standard of living as the Western Europe has. These standards will be tempered by the local culture and the local needs. I take India, for example. Most of India is temperate weather. You can manage without air conditioning. You can manage without lights, but it will affect the standard. This factor has to be considered in what standard of living the Western, whether they will copy the Western world. My assessment is not. They will have their own paradigm, will depend on the local conditions and the local cultures.
Christus, do you have a response to that?
I thought that was a statement rather than a question,
yes,
so I'm not...
I guess so. Okay, good, thank you. So, yes.
Mike Spencer, Cornell University. I have a systems question. In the 80s, President Carter of the United States said 1/4 of our energy would come from renewables. Not coincidentally, oil prices were high then. Since that time, solar has made dramatic gains, but still is not available. Installed solar is not good enough particularly without subsidies. And now with the real or not real gas boom, it seems, and my fear is that renewable funding for solar will not see the same levels that it has in the recent past, which is not very high. How do you fight this economic driver and still provide funding for these kind of renewables?
Anna, do you want to address that?
Yeah, excellent point. I think one of the things that we've seen is that subsidies are great to incubate and start new activities, new technologies, but in the long run, it needs to have an economic rent in order to be sustainable. That's part of a sustainable future. And so one of the things that we believe in is that one needs to start pricing nature. You need to put a value on nature. You need to put a value on carbon in order to allow for cleaner mechanisms to have a sustainable future. So even with the huge increase in availability of gas, I mean, let's not forget a decade ago or so, the world anticipated that we would run out of gas in 20, 30 years. Current hypotheses and assumptions are that it will be there for another 250 years. So the world will not run out of gas because there's no gas, like the world did not run out of stones because there were no stones. So subsidies to incubate good, pricing nature carbon necessary in order to have a sustainable future for renewables.
Okay, well, lots and lots of questions, and I should say now, I'm not going to be able to come to all of you, I'm afraid. So gentleman there with a microphone, and then we have gentlemen on the side here. And we'll try and keep it, so we'll have just one panelist answer each question, I think.
Thank you. Richard Tomasetti, Thornton Tomasetti, Inc. Concerning the standard of living again, going back to that, okay, shouldn't we be looking at really, as the gentleman said over there, what is that definition If we keep going in the direction that the definition of standard of living is becoming more and more of an ownership society and having more and more material things, as opposed to maybe having more people happy and having more people having less suffering, don't we have to use the latter to really get into sustainable solutions?
Jeff?
Just a couple words about this. There is a rather substantial and absolutely salutary movement to try to measure these things better and also look at the question of what's called subjective well-being. How do people assess their lives, the quality and life satisfaction? I think the points are generally the following. First, increasing material well-being as conventionally measured makes a big difference at the lower end of the income distribution, both within a society and internationally. Having electricity is a great thing from all points of view of quality of life. Having many of the benefits that are associated with a conventionally rising gross domestic product works. But one of the key, absolutely clear points is the declining marginal utility of income as conventionally measured, meaning that that extra 2% growth when you're already at $50,000 average per capita income, or why it is that our billionaires, as we read today, Mr. John Paulson, one of the richest hedge fund owners, $12 billion of wealth, wants to move to Puerto Rico to take advantage of a tax benefit. Really? There are not enough multiple lifetimes to spend that money humanly, physically possible in a finite body, even in a finite clan of all of Mr. Paulson's relations and probably everyone that he's ever met. This is absolutely a psychological phenomenon of perversity in a certain sense as well. Now, to come to the bottom line, the happiest societies are the social democracies of Scandinavia and of Latin America, like Costa Rica, which show that they come out at the top of the self-report. What does that mean? Good living standards as we would know them, but not the top. Social equality, high quality of community, good public health. And in Costa Rica's case, no army. These make a measurable difference in the reported quality of life. In the United States, by contrast, in what's called the Easterlin paradox, named after Professor Richard Easterlin of Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, the U.S. per capita income has tripled since 1960 without even a wiggle in the self-reported well-being in the United States. So there really is a very deep issue here. Why are we destroying the planet for something that doesn't even make us feel better?
Jeff, okay, I have to... Okay, well. We have, I want about now 2 or 3 minutes left for questioning. So a gentleman there with it was the microphone here, yes?
Tariq Durrani from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Recently, Madame Bukova, the Director General of UNESCO, stated that to develop sub-Saharan Africa, there will be a need for something of the order of 2 million engineers in the next 5 years. I'd like the panel's views of how that can be achieved, and is there a role for national academies to assist in the development of such areas? And I want to link this thing to what Professor Callistus Juma showed, the development of mobile communications throughout Africa. My question to him is that sustainable, or is it only dependent upon government subsidies over the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Juma, maybe you can just respond to that last part of the question.
Yeah, one of the cables, the SEACOM cable that connects South Africa to Europe, it's a $160 million investment. 75% of that is from African shareholders. It's almost all of it is private sector investment. And that's been the most interesting part about these cables. It's predominantly private sector investment. So the argument that there's no money available in Africa, that African countries need foreign aid or they need the government to subsidize many of these activities is just not valid. And on your first question, I don't know how UNESCO calculates those figures, because I don't think they collect any statistics on engineers in Africa in the first place.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to try and get 2 quick questions in. So, gentleman there, and then a lady at the back with her hand. She's been holding her hand up for a long time. Yes.
Hi, Zach Ema, mechanical engineering student at the University of Southern California. My question was actually very similar to the last one, but in developed nations, how are we going to achieve a smarter grid and overcome these different political challenges, such as you mentioned, Professor Sachs, and dealing with these politicians to upgrade the systems?
Anyone else want to?
I just wanted to say one thing about the engineers, and maybe a word about this, which is that anybody with broadband, and that's going to be almost everybody, at least potentially with access, will be able to get the massive online open courses, as they're now called, the MOOCs. And we should be thinking about massive education, free, online, globally available to take on these challenges. I don't know what it's going to do for our business models and our home universities. I think in the future my lectures, I hope, will be downloadable at 99 cents a lecture on iTunes, but probably it won't even be worth 99 cents. And so I don't know exactly the business model, but in terms of making knowledge available, we are in the greatest moment of history for mass education. And it should basically be free, because the marginal cost is 0 for another person to log on in their village on their 3G or 4G, which they're going to have because of the investments that Calestis was talking about. And if we can help to make sure that the contents there, whether it's 5 million or whatever number, will be available.
Thank you. Final questioner.
Hi, I'm Nikila Ravi. I'm studying at the University of Cambridge. We heard from Dr. Venter about the cost of producing a kilogram of beef. It was like 15,000 liters of water and 10 kilograms of feed. So why don't we give dietary choices more consideration? Why don't we publicize that more when we're considering sustainability? It seems that we don't emphasize how much effect we could have by making good dietary choices.
Thank you. Who would like to be given the final word on this? John.
Well, I'll just make a very brief comment on that. My own organisation attempted to do this in the various events that we ran, and the response was complaints about the lack of meat. So my response, I think it's an eminently sensible suggestion, but I think, like many other things, it requires a long period of education and awareness.
Thank you very much, John. Well, apologies to those who haven't had the chance to ask their questions, but I think that the rumbling of tummies is starting to be louder than the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please, once again, join me in thanking our panelists for a very enjoyable session.